Welcome to Season 2 of Keeping It 100, Real Conversations with Jacqui, where each week we will discuss life experiences with subject matter experts. Stay tuned for this next episode. Hello and welcome to Keeping It 100 Real Conversations with Jacqui, where we talk about real life experiences with special guests each week. And today we have Furkhan Dandia, and he's a men's coach. And we are going to be talking about mental health, but specifically focused on men's mental health. And my name is Jacqui Mono, and thank you so much for joining us today. Furk, we appreciate you being on our show today. How are you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, for sure, man. Thanks for coming on. It takes I'm sure you took a little bit of time to just kind of be on here. So I appreciate that. We'll give you a chance to talk to everyone about what you do, what you're about. And you also have your own podcast, Easy Conversations. So we'll talk dive into a little bit more about your podcast and how people can contact you as well at the end.
Sure. Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah. So well, I'll give it to you to talk about a little bit about yourself. Tell us what you do, who you are, what you're about, and why should we be listening to you right
now? Sounds good. So I'm a engineer by day, working in the oil and gas industry. And then on the side, I kind of do men's coaching, just out of passion. So the story kind of goes with, when my son was born, I really started questioning what my purpose is in life. I had this vision at that time of doing these things within my company, becoming a VP one day. But then after becoming a father, I started questioning all of that and trying to understand, okay, well, what kind of purpose do I have in life, and how am I doing anything different? And this is not to take anything away from all the other fathers or men out there who do great work. But for me, it was more about how am I giving back? How am I making this world a different place for my son to grow up in? It was very conflicting, and I started kind of asking all these questions. I went and did a business degree, and then when I was done, I still felt that emptiness, and then had to go through some life challenges. Go through separation, go through divorce, and I really started working on myself, seeking therapy. Reading a lot, and that's when I realized that for me, my passion lies in helping other men, and part of that motivation came from me myself being alone when I was kind of struggling and not feeling comfortable or vulnerable enough to be able to ask for help or talk to other men about it. And when you start digging a little bit deeper, you realize that there's in society we've created the stigma around men not being able to ask for help or being vulnerable. And I wanted to move past that stigma and give other men the freedom or that level of comfort where they could ask for help and normalize those conversations. And that's kind of where the idea of my podcast came about too. It's really around getting different guests, specifically men. I'll occasionally have women as well, but really normalizing conversations around mental health, whether people want to talk about their own struggles and how they've been able to overcome them. It's really to make other people that are listening feel that they can relate, that they're not alone, and that Absolutely. They can also ask for help and seek therapy or just feeling comfortable enough talking to their friends or family about some of the stuff they're dealing with.
Absolutely. No, that makes total sense. Let's just kind of dive in a little bit more about the stigma, specifically for men when it comes to mental health. Mental health has come a long way. People are a little bit more open about, every mental health situation looks different for everybody, right? So when it comes to men specifically, what are some of the signs where, from a woman's perspective, diving a little bit more gender specific, what are some of the signs that one would feel like, okay, maybe this is time for me to actually take a step and see if I can get a little bit of help? What are those? What should we be looking for, or what should guys be looking for in this setting here?
So you're asking specifically as a person that you see a man struggling and what are the
Right.
signs? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think a lot of the times, you know, like personally, I can only speak for myself, but when I was struggling, I would always put on a brave face and I would tell everyone I'm doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Even my close friends, I'm like, yeah, everything's good. But you could tell when the person's not themselves, right? Like if you've known someone for a long time or you know someone really well, you could tell their energy changes. So if they're struggling, they're not,
Mm-hmm.
if they're an extroverted person, they may stop coming out or they may just
Mm-hmm.
stay to themselves. If they're introverted, they may just not even like reach out. So those could be some signs where you start noticing, okay, well, maybe there's something going on.
Right.
Um, I mean, there's signs, all kinds of signs, really. But in those moments, what I like to tell people is really mm, telling the other person that, hey, I'm here for you. I'm here to listen. I won't, because sometimes all a person needs is to be heard. They don't need advice. They don't need guidance. It's just knowing that someone's there to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
But assuring that if they did open up, you wouldn't judge them. There wouldn't be any shame. It would stay between you know you two. It'd be confidential because those are things that personally as men we are worried about. We don't want
Right.
other people knowing because again, it's all about keeping it together. So if I'm
Right.
trusting you and I'm opening up to you, um, maybe one of my concerns would be: is she going to go tell someone? So that
That
if
sense of
I
confidentiality,
yeah,
right?
yeah, it's
Yeah.
just being comfortable knowing that, hey, if I'm going to be vulnerable with this person, this is
Mm.
going to stay between us. And at the same time, you don't want to be shamed or judged. A lot of times amongst men, this happens quite a bit where they'll make comments like, oh, you're being a sissy or man up, and that
Mm.
doesn't help, right? Hearing that. So
Mm. Mm.
knowing that if you did open up and the other person did make a comment like that, it's easier to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, stuff like that, just providing some form of safety, and assuring that there would be no judgment or shaming with opening up.
That makes sense. So okay, so when we kind of dive into more of like a culturally, some cultures, you know, young boys are basically brought up to be the tough. You don't cry. You don't show emotion. You know what I mean? Like you have to tough it up, like what you said, or
Mm.
you stop being a sissy kind of thing. What are some ways where if there was maybe a teenager or maybe a young kid listening to this and somehow they stumbled into this podcast?
Yeah.
What are some of the ways where they can actually just be okay with being themselves? What are some of the ways that you would advise them?
Yeah, I think it's really that's a tough one as a teenager, as a kid. I think we're obviously, like you said, we're becoming more aware of the importance of
Hmm.
letting people express themselves. But going back when I was a teenager or a kid, I wish I had someone, maybe an older sibling. I'm the eldest, so I didn't have that. Maybe an older sibling or a mentor that I could have signed up with, that I could have spoken to, right?
Right.
So one of the things I was doing before COVID, I was volunteering uh, with Hull Services, which is they help. So basically, I was mentoring a teenage boy. So I was kind of his person if he ever needed to be vulnerable or express himself. I would be there to listen to him. So there are programs like that. So as teenagers or kids, if you want to sign up, they can match you up with mentors like myself,
Hmm.
and you can have those conversations. And that's where I my goal was really to give back, right? And it wasn't to, again, it was really volunteering. So I knew my role in that relationship, and that was of being non-judgmental and not shaming and listening to this kid express his feelings. So there are programs like that kids can join.
Hmm.
Um,
That's good to
go,
know.
yeah, and going back to the
Mm.
cultural thing, I don't think I'm Pakistani by background, so I've experienced the Pakistani culture, which is a little bit more. yeah, we don't, growing up, we didn't really talk about our feelings. We didn't express ourselves. And it was almost like, yeah, if I ever cried, I was told to not cry because I'm a boy. But even growing up in Canada, the Canadian culture was fairly similar. You kind of like, if you're playing sports, like if you're playing hockey, you get hit or you get hurt, you're not allowed to complain. If you
Hmm.
complain, everyone makes fun of you. So I don't think culturally it's an issue. I think it's more of a generational thing where boys or even men, they're, again, it's that expectation of not complaining, not whining, not crying, stuff like
Hmm.
that. And I think we've come a long way. And obviously, the reason why we're having all these conversations is because we're more aware and cognizant of the impact
Hmm.
those dialogues or narratives we create can have on men growing up. And you see men in my age group or even older that struggle now and they don't know how to express themselves. They're confused, they're suffering in silence. So those are the consequences. And we're seeing that now. And and at least what I'm doing with my son is giving him that liberty and freedom to own his emotions and feelings and not asking them to hold them back. So hopefully other people are doing that with the generation of boys that are growing up now.
Absolutely. So, I mean, okay. So, speaking of generational, it's a generational thing. Are you comfortable now, like being able to, like, let's say, talk to your dad, or your uncles, like people who are a little bit older, and just are you guys open enough to talk about mental health now? How does that look in your world? Or yeah.
Well, I think there's still that lack of awareness with you know with men my dad's age. So I mean, I do push the barrier a little bit with him, at least with my dad,
Hmm.
and I've had some very difficult conversations with him. So I was on another podcast recently, and I talked about the conversations I had with my dad about my childhood and telling him about you know and when I say trauma, I don't mean like severe traumatic events, but I think everyone experiences some form of trauma in their childhood,
Yeah.
whether it's from their parents or someone else. In my case, there was a couple of incidents I had with my father, and those defined my childhood. And until I didn't do the therapy work, I didn't realize the importance or the significance of those events.
Hmm.
So a couple of years ago, I sat down and I had that conversation with my dad. 10, 15 years ago, I would have been like, there's no way I'm ever going to talk to my dad about that stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't think he expected it either, but he received it really well. Like, to his credit, he was not defensive. He owned it and he apologized. And I think being able to have that conversation and, when I tell my other friends, they're shocked too. Because again, it's
Mm.
just not something that as men my age we do.
Yeah.
It's not very common, at least. So I think there is that shift happening, and even within my circle of friends, we do share. We do get vulnerable. Again, it's not where it
Actually, I
needs
was
to
just
be.
about to ask you, like,
Yeah.
how is the dynamic when you're with your friends? Like, yeah, exactly. Okay, I like that. Okay, now that I don't have to ask that one, I can talk all about it.
It's so. I mean, I do have a circle of friends, and I think the fact that I'm able to talk about it myself, I feel like
Mm.
they also feel comfortable sharing now. But I have different social groups, and with the men in each social group, we do talk about our feelings. We do talk about things we're struggling with, and we do get vulnerable. Now, is it like, do we get 100% vulnerable? No, because there's a lot of things even I shy away from. I don't talk about.
Right.
And again, it's that mental blocker of not coming across as needy or weak. And it's something I'm continuously working on because, I mean, you
Hmm.
think about it, it's been years and years of programming that you have to bypass now.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's crazy. Like, over the last 3, 4 years, all my guy friends, we do have very vulnerable conversations. We talk about our feelings. We talk about things we're struggling with. We talk about our emotions. We talk about a lot of things that I don't think were common, at least for me, um, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I also know a lot of my friends that aren't comfortable talking about those things, or they never go
Mm-hmm.
there. So it's interesting to see that dynamic, and how um, we're evolving. Even
Right.
just in your social groups, you can see that evolution happening, and I see it in other groups too. So I have a huge community of men I connect with on Instagram through the coaching work I do, and there's a lot of men's support groups out there, in various cities across the world, where just men talk about these kind of things, and they sit in these groups and circles, and they share their feelings and emotions and stuff like that. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And okay, so from your personal experience, or just just from what the people that you've worked with, are you finding that sometimes when guys tend to suppress their emotions or whatever, it kind of trickles down into their relationships, the way they interact with their peers? Do you find that's quite a challenge out there?
Absolutely. I think,
Hmm.
I mean, again, you may not see that trickle down effect uh, in the workplace, because, typically you don't talk about your feelings. I mean, very rarely at work. But I
Hmm.
definitely see that impact on their romantic relationships. So with their
Hmm.
partners, um, because they hold back their emotions, it's frustrating for both parties, right? So the partner's trying to figure out, okay, well, what is going on with my partner here? I
Hmm.
don't know what he's trying to tell me. I don't know what he's feeling, and then the guy is also feeling frustrated because he just wants his partner to figure out
What's
what's going
going
on,
on?
right?
Yeah, I find
Rather
that a
than
lot of
express.
the time guys expect us to know what they're thinking when we really don't, right? So that's a tricky one too, because um, sure, I guess, yeah, it can, that can be tricky because a lot of the times nobody's a mind reader. So
Yeah,
until there's a level of that line of communication where somebody just straight says straight up, okay, this is how I'm feeling. You just
yeah,
never know how somebody's feeling. You can't make
yeah,
assumptions, right?
yeah. And
I mean,
I
you
think the
can, but
communication piece in relationships is a whole different
hmm,
layer, and probably a tangent we don't want to get into today. But I
yeah.
feel like, people in relationships tend to hold back their emotions in general. Not men specifically. I've seen it on both ends.
Hmm.
But yeah, speaking of men, yeah, that's the thing. So when they're suppressing their feelings, if they're not really expressing themselves, you see that trickle down effect in romantic relationships too. And part of the work I try to do, or I've been researching a lot on, is again going back to the childhood trauma. So childhood trauma obviously shapes who you become as an adult. And quite often, a lot of people don't know why they are sensitive to certain things, what their triggers are, what their
Hmm.
attachment styles are. So when I work with people, it's really identifying their triggers and their attachment styles, so they can not only understand themselves better and work on themselves, but then they can communicate that to their partners. So, if I have an attachment style that's very anxious, it's for me to understand, obviously, and then I can also understand the things I need in a relationship, or any relationship for that matter. But then I
Hmm.
can also communicate that to my partner, saying, "Hey, I'm very anxious. These are the things I need from you." And then
Right.
that, if I'm communicating that to my partner, now she knows why I react a certain way and what I need in those moments. So it's very important to do that work and then be vulnerable about it. So then you can have an open relationship where there's communication happening, and you're expressing your needs, and what you the things you need in those moments where you're really triggered. And then being able to also be vulnerable about your triggers, saying, hey,
Hmm.
the reason why I'm sensitive when you say something like that is because this is what happened in my childhood. I'm aware of it and I'm working through it, but I just want you to know. And if your
I like that
partner,
actually. Yeah.
yeah, and if your partner is really also, like, typically what I try to do is identify, in any relationship you want to make sure you and your partner are both growing. You don't have to do the same work, but as long as you're growing and understanding each other, it can make a very healthy relationship. And the expectation is, if you're communicating your needs and your triggers, that they're doing the same, then you can understand each other better. Because what happens typically is if I react, my partner thinks, and typically if it's a trigger, I'm going to overreact. She may see something really small and I'm just going to like exaggerate it. And she's going to be like, whoa, what happened here? But if she has
Mm-hmm.
an understanding of what's happening, she can realize that she doesn't need to personalize this, but give me my space and really help me work through it. And the same can happen vice versa, right? So
Yeah,
it's really understanding yourself, putting in that work, and then being vulnerable to communicate it to the other person so
absolutely.
they have a better understanding too, and they're just not confused when those moments happen.
Mm-hmm. No, actually, that totally makes sense. And that's communication is such a lot of people tend to have different ways of communicating, and some people communicate through body language, some people communicate verbally, or some people it's just visual, or whatever the case may be. So what are you finding that now, our generation, in terms of like the difference of the way we approach mental health, let's say in the workplace or just personal life, or how are you finding has evolved over time in term, yeah, like what do you see the differences? Do you see progress, or do you think that we still need a lot of work to we have a lot of work to do to be able to make it apparent that people need to kind of focus on it?
Yeah, so I'm seeing, I definitely, like, from when before it used to be like talked about, but we didn't really understand what mental health was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think again, even if I was to look like 5 or 10 years back, there was like the stigma around mental health. It was like, oh, if you say you struggle with mental health, there's something wrong with you, right?
Right.
Whereas now, I've seen that progress where it's talked about more. Even during COVID at the workplace, we there's more conversation around it, and whereas in the past, especially in oil and gas, it wasn't, like a lot of your meetings started with a safety moment and that was it. And now I've seen an evolution of safety moments becoming about mental health as well, because
Okay,
that
that's
is also
amazing.
important.
Mm-hmm.
You can be in the field. Yeah, there's a safety concern with pieces of equipment where you can hurt yourself, but if your mental health, you're struggling or you're dealing with something, you could still hurt yourself. So I think there are a lot of those conversations that are taking place now. I still believe there's a lot of work to do. I believe we all struggle with mental health in different ways. It's just like childhood trauma, I said, which manifests itself into your adult life, and
Mm-hmm.
that can create mental health. And that doesn't mean like everyone's kind of on the same. We don't need to label people, but we all kind of struggle with anxiety at some point. We all kind of have a little bit of depression every now and then, mild forms or severe forms. And that's something we need to normalize, because I think there's still that stigma of not wanting to accept it, because you may feel that you may get judged, you may get shamed.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of work that needs to happen there. um, and I think we need to be more open about talking about these things. So while I've
Absolutely.
seen a lot of progress, I still feel like there's a lot of work to do, and especially coming out of the pandemic, I think there's we need to talk about it even more. Personally, I know there was times during the pandemic where I did feel like really isolated, or just really struggling. And I know a lot of my friends who've also opened up about it to me in a similar fashion, just being locked up at home, not being able to see friends or family, not being able to go out the way you do, not being able
Mm.
to play sports or whatever it is that you do in your daily life. We were all dealing with some form of loss or grief. And
Grief,
loss
yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to mean that you lost someone, a loved one. Grief doesn't have to come with that. We've all
Mm-hmm.
experienced some form of loss, and that can create mental health challenges. And we need to be able to talk about it, especially coming out of the pandemic. Now we're going to see a lot more of it. So hopefully, people are more open about it and are willing to seek help.
Right.
That's all I can say. Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about accessibility in terms of getting help and therapy. So I mean, if you've seen a therapist, chances are you've paid probably between
Hmm.
150 to about $300 an hour, and not everybody has the luxury to be able to pay that every session or every week or every month or whatever, however it looks like for everybody's financial. What are your thoughts in terms of accessibility? I know we have a lot of programs in Calgary, which is awesome. That that are they kind of look at what your financial situation looks like. Therefore, this is what you can get. But a lot of the times when you really, really want to dive deep into a certain issue, you go and see this therapist, and you may not necessarily see the same therapist all the time because it's Alberta Health regulated. So like, they have a case file, but you don't necessarily get that connection with that one person. This is just from like just personal experience, or just from hearing from other people's experiences, where you find that you can't necessarily get to the root of whatever issue that you're having because you can't necessarily connect with that person because it's a free service, and therefore this is what you get. Let's talk a little bit about accessibility and what your opinions are on that.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an issue. I've talked about it. I know it's a very sensitive issue. So, I mean, it is a problem because obviously insurance companies don't cover a lot of it,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately. As you alluded to, there are sliding scale kind of structures within when you go see a psychologist, but even that can be fairly expensive. Like even if they kind of scale it based on your salary, you're probably still spending $50 to $100.
Mm-hmm.
And then obviously the psychologists that aren't registered, they're cheaper, but then you can't claim it with insurance.
Mm.
So there's that catch 22 there. One of the things I would suggest for people that do need help, there's a lot of group therapy that is slightly cheaper. So, you can do whether it's a men's group or any form of group. I think some of them are like 12 weeks long, and they're about $100 for the entire duration.
Okay.
And yeah, they're like subsidized by the government or the city. So I would recommend looking at group therapy. The only caution I would exercise with group therapy is that you may not be able to individually find the answers, but you may get some help just sitting around and learning from others.
Mm-hmm.
So if you really want to work on yourself, you're not going to get that because the only way to get it is one-on-one
Mm-hmm.
with the psychologist. Um, the other thing is there's are coaches out there that aren't psychologists, but they're just coaches. You can work with them. Again, you'd have to do your research and make sure the type of person you want to work with is really able to help you through. One of
And
the
that's
things
something that you do too, right? So
Yeah, one
you.
of the things I do, so I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing a master's in psychology. So part of my coaching strategy is to build psychology into my practice. So, like the way I do it, and I don't know if everyone does it this way. I know something like the work I do is fairly unique, but it's working through whatever triggers or issues you may have, identifying those, and then working through them and setting goals for the future in terms of how you're going to take responsibility and navigate through those. So that's my approach. I don't know if everyone does it that way. So yeah, I mean, coaches are cheaper. Again, they're not registered, so you can't claim through insurance. And not everyone has a psychology background or are studying
Mm-hmm.
psychology. So that's the other caution I would exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, if you really need that one-on-one help, you can find a coach potentially, or the only other option is a psychologist. So
Right.
accessibility is definitely a challenge.
Mm-hmm.
We do see that quite a bit. At least here in Calgary, we have really good psychologists. There's one pretty much everywhere. Um, so I would recommend people check them out. The affordability is where it comes down to.
Yeah, I believe that also. I think social workers that have a master's in social work can
Hmm.
also practice as therapists from at least a guest that we had on the show in this first season. So yeah, so I think also if a social worker that holds a master's in social work can actually practice, so that's something to kind of think about if people are actually looking for.
Yeah, again, I don't know. I'm not too sure about that. I know a
Hmm.
lot of like in my master's program in psychology or
Hmm.
counseling psychology, there are a lot of social workers. So I think they also need to get some form of degree in psychology to be able to practice.
That makes sense.
Otherwise, yeah, because ultimately you need that master's to be able to be a registered psychologist and to be approved. So
Okay.
yeah, there's many layers, but I do agree accessibility is a significant issue, as well as affordability. I myself, I can relate. When I was going for therapy, like I still go, but earlier on I was probably going once every week or once every 2 weeks, and yeah, I was spending a lot of money. Um, and for me, I wanted to prioritize that for my mental health. Again, it's not affordable for everyone, so it
Hmm.
does get pricey. I know my insurance wasn't covering it. I think my first 2 or 3 sessions were covered, and after that, I was
I was
paying
gonna
a lot
say,
of
I think
money.
my insurance only covered like 3 sessions, and then it was
Yeah,
done. I was like, oh geez,
yeah,
right? And then after that, you have to figure it out. But yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the sliding scale does help, or if you tell your psychologist, that, "Hey, my insurance doesn't cover it," they can work with you. But
Hmm.
it is still relatively expensive. You're still looking at close to $100 a session, especially if you're going to someone that's registered. So,
Absolutely, which makes sense. I mean, they went to school for that; they put in the work, so we have to
mhm,
kind of accredit them according
mhm.
to that qualifications. So yeah, and then okay, just to add on to another piece is, do you think that workplaces, especially bigger corporations, should be at least subsidizing for their employees to be able to, to get a specific program when it comes to, or have like, you know what I mean, like just have like
There,
some form of mental health package where make it okay for their employees to be able to see someone to be able to deal with whatever it is that they have to deal with.
yeah, so most corporations do provide
Hmm.
a program.
Yeah.
So I know, like the companies I've worked for, they provide an employee assistance program, and you
Hmm.
can call a number. They can set you up with a psychologist. I think
Okay.
they all only cover 3 to 5 sessions, I think.
Hmm.
So again, not ideal, but they do provide that.
Hmm.
There's pros and cons to that as well, but I think it's still, there's something there. I do agree there needs to be more. We need to do more.
Hmm.
One of the things I've tried to discuss, or at least raise awareness on, we need to have, like, how you have a HR person in house, or you have a finance person in house. We probably, corporations need to start considering having an in-house psychologist. But
Absolutely.
that's a separate, I think, again,
Hmm.
another tangent that we could get into. But
Hmm.
with that, there's other confidentiality issues that could come up. So um, maybe something needs to happen. I don't
Hmm.
know what it would look like, but I do definitely think that we need, or corporations need, in-house psychologists that employees can go talk to, especially if they're overwhelmed or they're stressed. There's a lot of mental health issues, and the reason why I want to work with men, especially in the corporate sector, is, whether it could be divorce, it could be
Hmm.
job security, it could be grief, it could be performance issues. There's many layers, even in corporate worlds, with mental health that are not addressed or are not talked about, and that's something I want to focus on as well. But I
Hmm.
do think there needs to be more that needs to be happening. Unfortunately, we're not there yet.
Absolutely. Okay, so what are some of your takeaways to our audience out there, that you could, I don't know, would like to finish off with? Maybe some advice of how they can kind of come out and just be themselves and not be afraid to be vulnerable or talk about their issues or whatever the case may be. What would be your final words for that?
Well, I think, I mean, it is hard being vulnerable. I
Mm-hmm.
struggled with it my entire life. I still struggle with it, as much as I like to encourage others to do it. I still have my own blockers that I
Mm-hmm.
work through every day. But ultimately, the best piece of advice I can give is surround yourself with people that will accept you for who you
Absolutely.
are and encourage you and lift you up. I know, going through a divorce specifically, I really had to change my social circle. There was a lot of negativity, there was a lot of shaming, a lot of judgment, and I had to get out of that because that was only pulling me down even more. So in
Yeah.
my personal experience, I surrounded myself with positivity and like-minded people who also wanted to grow. And one of the biggest takeaways I've had over the past few years is, everyone. I try to talk about this a lot, but everyone has a certain purpose in your life, and some people may be there from start to finish,
Mm-hmm.
and some people may only be there for an hour or a few days or a few months, and it's okay. And I know it sucks, but you need to surround yourself with people who will accept you and encourage you to be yourself. And some people may come into your life and do that for a very short amount of time, and their purpose will
Absolutely.
be done. So do
Mm-hmm.
not be afraid to cut out people from your life that are not
Serving
serving
you.
you.
I'm a
Exactly.
huge believer of that. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And how can people contact you? Let's talk a little bit about your podcast, Easy Conversations, because you're focused specifically on men's mental health, men. You know what I mean? The dynamics of what men go through. So let's talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, like what inspired it was just, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and what I found was I couldn't really relate to a lot of the mental health podcasts. It was typically celebrities or athletes or high profile people that were coming in and sharing their stories, which is amazing. But it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
relate because for people like myself, I don't have the same pressures or resources that they have. So what
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do, and at the same time, as I was becoming more vulnerable, I was having really interesting and deep conversations with my friends. We'd be out for coffee or we'd be at a pub or whatever. We'd get into really deep things. And I started thinking, I'm like, well, this can be a podcast. Someone can listen to this and
Mm.
learn from this, but then also feel that they're not alone and become vulnerable on their own time and space. So that kind of inspired the podcast, and hence the name Easy Conversations. It's,
Mm-hmm.
again, we can normalize these discussions, and they don't have to be hard or difficult. Uh, so that's kind of what kicked it off. And fortunately, I've been, super grateful and blessed to have amazing guests like yourself come on and
Thank you.
and and share their stories. And what that helps with is for a listener saying, oh, I can relate to this person. I struggle in a similar fashion, and know that, while people are struggling, they were able to figure it out, whether asking for help, doing the work themselves. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with struggling, as long as you're doing the work to get out of it, right? and and
Absolutely.
yeah, that's kind of the inspiration. And again, like, I've had many people reach out, say, and that's what makes me it motivates me to keep going, is when people reach out saying, hey, I really learned a lot. This made a huge difference for me. I have similar struggles. So yeah, that's kind of the podcast, and it's available on all the streaming platforms. um, but yeah.
And I'll also leave a link for the audience to check out your podcast as well, in the show notes. Okay, well, this is great. I think this is a great way to actually finish off. Do you have any resource suggestions to, if somebody's like, okay, I really do, I should probably check myself. Who can they contact, or can they contact you if they have any direct questions?
Yeah, I would, if anyone, if they need resources or they want to ask questions or they want to bounce ideas off, I'm always available. Like, I typically, like, for me, I don't really want to make money here. I'm just wanting to help. So the best way to get a hold of me is on Instagram. So my account is Unoya Zen. So
Perfect.
EUNOIAZEN. So yeah, hit me up on Instagram or my website, unoyazen.com. Really, I think, what I try to tell people with therapy is just, and this was one of my biggest barriers, was earlier on, even like 5-10 years ago. I looked at therapy as almost a negative thing.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, if I'm going for therapy, that means I'm admitting defeat or failure. And that's not it. It's like what I try to tell people and try to normalize therapy is it's like your car. Like regardless of what car you have, you need to take it in for service or maintenance in order to make it, have the longevity of your car and make sure it runs smoothly. That's like your
Mm-hmm.
mental health. You need to
Absolutely.
go in for that therapy, the regular check-in to make sure things are fine and you don't have a breakdown um, at some point in the future. You want to keep that.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just as much as we take care of ourselves physically, nutrition wise, we have to take care of ourselves mentally, just so
Mhm.
that it's all connected, right? Mind,
Exactly.
body,
So,
soul. Yeah.
so there's nothing wrong with seeking therapy. So, you don't have to contact me for that. But yeah, find a therapist. The other thing I would like to say is, in my own experience, and a lot of people who have gone for therapy can also relate that, if you go for therapy once and you don't like the therapist, don't give up. In my case, I had to go through 5 or 6 different therapists until I found the one that was really able to work with me and in the way I needed to be challenged. And everyone has a different style. So
Mm-hmm.
you may not align with the first 1 or 2 therapists, but don't let that discourage you. Try to understand where it is that you need help and maybe even have an interview session with your therapist when you call them up saying, hey, this is the kind of therapy I need, or this is the kind of issues I need to work through. And they
Mm-hmm.
can tell you whether or not you guys would be a good fit.
Absolutely.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's some way you can save money and time and frustration by doing that homework. And the last piece of advice I would give is if you feel like you've dealt with something, don't assume that, okay, I'm good to go. Nothing can impact me anymore. There's a lot of stuff we bury over time that we don't necessarily deal with, and it can surface at different times. So I've gone for
Sure.
therapy, and I've been able to deal through a lot of things from childhood. And then,
Mm-hmm.
a month later, I'll get triggered again, and that allows me to be curious to understand, okay, why am I triggered? What happened in the past
Mm-hmm.
that is causing these emotions and feelings inside of me? And that forces me to go back. So there's nothing wrong with going back, taking breaks. Just be mindful of that. It's not a one size fits all type of solution either. So yeah, that's all I can say about
This
therapy.
That's perfect. That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and experiences with us, Ferk. And also, just to kind of finish off, a little conclusion. Mental health affects everyone, whether you're a man, woman, other genders, doesn't really matter. Everybody needs to take care of their mental health. So,
Absolutely.
just yeah, right. So I will leave your contact details on the show notes. You guys will be able to reach out to Ferk if you need to. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was great. I love it. And please let us know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching this on YouTube. And subscribe to our podcast streaming stuff. We have so many.
Yeah.
I'll list them all below. All right. Okay. Well, have a good one, my dear. And thank you again for joining us today. And we will see you guys soon.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Take care. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. Please do not forget to leave us an awesome review, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and keep your notifications on for the next episodes ahead. If you'd like to be a guest on our show, please do not hesitate to contact us at Jacqui@rhythmfitness.ca.